Hi, everyone. This is Professor Hall, and this is 6 Things to Know About Charlotte Temple, History and Background. If you haven't already, please listen to my first lecture, which gives the overview of the novel. And then after this, you can listen to my next lecture, which goes into the aspects of the novel in terms of literature. So it looks at things like structure and themes and characterization. These are just 6 things I think it's helpful to know before reading the book. So let's get started. So first, we have an empowered author. And I love this picture so much. I think that when we talk about women historically, a lot of people say things like, back then, women didn't blank. So back then, women didn't have jobs. Back then, women just were in the house. Back then, women didn't have any rights. And certainly in many instances, that was true. I mean, we have the first wave of feminism, which is trying to get votes for women, the suffrage movement, and then the second wave of the 1960s and 70s. But that does not mean that women back then, in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, many women did have jobs. If they didn't have money, they would be working as, in various positions, governesses, maids, cooks, those kind of things, helping on farms. And even when they did have money, they still did a lot for social justice causes, and many of them did have jobs. And that is the case with our author. So Susanna Rowson was born in 1762. Her father was a British naval officer. Her mother died in childbirth, and at that point, they were sent to the American colonies. So they lived in Massachusetts until after the Revolutionary War. Then they went back to Britain, and then she came back to America. And she was very well educated. Her family had enough money, her father being an officer in the military. But she chose to work as a governess because she had a passion for education. While working as a governess, she published her first novel, Victoria, in 1786. Charlotte Temple followed 5 years later in 1791. And she also worked in a theater. She owned a theater company with her husband. Once she got married, they opened a theater company that they ran together. So they were actors, and then they owned this theater company. She left the theater world to found Mrs. Rowson's Academy for Young Ladies in downtown Boston. She felt that middle-class girls like herself should receive a good education. So she wasn't extremely wealthy, but she was part of the middle class, and she felt like sometimes girls weren't educated well. So that's one of the reasons she opened this academy. And this is a little newspaper clipping talking about a spring reception of scholars for girls to come and find out more about the academy. And they would be having board every quarter tuition for reading, writing, arithmetic, English grammar, geography and the use of globes, useful needlework, embroidery, painting, pianoforte, music lessons, dancing lessons, and so forth. So girls would be able to be educated in all the basic subjects and also refinements. So things that would serve them as young ladies, dancing and playing music and drawing and that kind of thing. She was also the first editor of the Boston Weekly Magazine from 1802 to 1805 and continued publishing other books. So she ran this academy, she edited a weekly magazine, and she was a publisher, and she was a wife and mother. So quite accomplished. And this is an important point for me to make because I think a lot of times people think that the author and the character of a book, the main character, are very much similar. And that is not the case, especially not here. Charlotte is not an empowered character. We'll talk about that more next time. But the author of the book really was and had quite a bit of agency and did amazing things in her life. Number 2, novels are morally corrupt. So this is something that I don't know if many people realize because coming up in school in this day and age, we're always told to read and to read more, and we're always assigned books in school and in classes like this one. But at a certain point in time, when novels were first coming forward as an art form, prior to that, you had a lot of plays, you had a lot of poems, and much work was either spiritually based or philosophical, scientific, nonfiction. And when fiction as a novel became more popular, people objected. So this is the Reverend Samuel Miller, and he said that people who read novels were suffering both intellectual and moral injury, and of course incurring a diminution of happiness. So he thought that if you read a book, you will be books are too easy to read and understand. That was one argument. Another argument is that books were just for women and that women should be doing something better with their time. But you would be dumber, you would be morally corrupt, and you would be less happy if you read fiction. And if you think that it was just reverence, think again, because this is from Thomas Jefferson. He said that a novel was a great obstacle to a good education. When this poison infects the mind, it destroys its tone. Reason and fact, plain and unadorned, are rejected. The result is a bloated imagination, sickly judgment, and a disgust toward the real business of life. So again, it's almost like what we hear about with TV today, right? Or being online, that TV rots your brain, that you're stupider if you're going to be on the internet so much. And really, many of them, and I don't have a quote, but this was sort of part of the conversation, that novels are just for young women and they shouldn't be taken seriously. These are men coming out of the age of reason and the age of enlightenment. And so their concerns are for people to read philosophical works, for people to investigate things scientifically. So books with their emotions, and we're not quite into symbolism quite yet for the most part, but with their emotions and their characters and their symbolism, and people are reading these for fun when they should be working or putting their mind to better use, this is horrific to them. And I wanted to bring this up because even today, this is not my slide, but even today, this is kind of the conversation about fiction. Commercial fiction attracts a broad audience and may also fall into any subgenre. So mystery, romance, legal thrillers, Western, science fiction, science fantasy, horror, chick lit, you name it, right? A broad audience. A lot of people like it. And opposed on the opposite end is literary fiction, which you can see this person has defined as it tends to appeal to a smaller, more intellectually adventurous audience. And because of these definitions, many scholars and critics and teachers will think of things that are popular as not worthy of study or comment. So if you have a book and it becomes a New York Times bestseller and it was just published this year and a lot of people like it, it's probably garbage and we should just read things that are older and by established authors and part of what's called the canon, meaning the list of books that is approved for study. And if you've seen the book list for this class, you can probably guess how I feel about this. I think that this is ridiculous. So what's interesting to me about this book is that at the time, and even many years after, you could see this is printed in 1791. Thomas Jefferson said the thing about novels in 1818. And many critics did not think that the book had a lot of merit. And so it was commercially a wild success. People loved it. But many people critics and scholars and politicians thought that it was trash, but it is studied in college classrooms, this one, and I studied it in college as well. And what is the reason for that? Well, one of the reasons is that it is older. And so is it literature just because it's older? Maybe it stood the test of time, but we're also reading a book that was just printed last year. For what that's worth. But you kind of need to know, just going into this, that this was a point of contention when the book was written. And it will kind of be for you to determine whether you think it should still be commercial fiction or whether it should be considered literary. All right, so number 3, sentimental and seduction novels. Sentimental novels were based on sentimentality or feelings. So again, coming out of the age of reason and enlightenment, they are trying to have books that are filled with passion or pathos, meaning that they're using emotion to not only move forward the story, but also to create kind of an argument. So there's a message or a moral or a lesson, however you want to put it, for the reader to learn. We're not quite at the point yet where people are just writing books for the enjoyment of reading, for the pleasure of being in a story. We're not quite there yet. The next books we read that are older also have, kind of a message, but really they're stories. This book is meant to have a specific lesson. So Uncle Tom's Cabin, as I mentioned in my last lecture, is another novel that is in this sentimental tradition. Harriet Beecher Stowe is using emotions to try to make the reader feel sympathy for the slaves and to try to make the readers feel connection to the slaves in the story, so that they will be in favor of abolishing slavery, right? And it worked because, Abraham Lincoln said that she was the little lady who helped start the war. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau, another philosopher, he theorized that people were naturally good and that a person's moral development was developed by experiencing powerful sympathy for others. So at the same time, while some people think that novels are trash and they'll make you morally corrupt, other people are saying, no, actually, if you read someone's story, you connect with them, you understand their experience in a way that you could not do otherwise. And therefore, you become a more moral person. So because of this thinking, many authors attempted to write books with a strong message. And I think, too, that they wanted to write fiction, but they were worried about the arguments about fiction corrupting people. So they try even harder to make them good books that are for little boys and girls to read and to become better people. So instead of using logic to try to make readers do the right thing, they use sympathetic, and this is kind of the key here, if I can get my pen, there we go, emotionally exaggerated situations. Really hard to write on my little mouse pad. Emotionally exaggerated. So they will use terms in this book, and the narrator will talk to try to bring out the emotion of the reader. And certainly what happens in this tragedy is every horrible thing that could possibly happen, right? So it's a little bit exaggerated to try to make you feel sympathetic. A seduction novel is a type of sentimental novel where a naive girl is seduced or tricked by a wicked man, and she becomes pregnant or has her virtue destroyed in some way. Sometimes it is because she's been seduced. Sometimes it's because it appears as if she has been seduced. So, a book for silly girls. This is critic Lydia Maria Child, writing about 40 years after the book was published. I dare say Charlotte Temple was written with the best intention, yet I believe few works do so much harm to girls of 14 or 15. So you can see how it was talked about, right? So seduction novels, just to give you a little bit more depth on this. There's an upright man, a lot of times, a seducer, and a coquette or a flirt. I mentioned the book The Coquette in the last lecture, and this has this type of a love triangle. There is a coquette. She's flirting with two men. One of them is a good, solid, honorable man. The other one is a seducer, and unfortunately she picks the wrong guy. So the implication is kind of that if you flirt with someone, you reap what you sow. In some way you'll be punished for not being a good girl, and tragedy will be heaped upon you. Some authors, like Susanna Rowson, who eventually, as we know, first she was a governess and a tutor, and later she went on to found the Academy for Girls. She really believed in education. So some of the authors writing these seduction novels are advocating for female education to prepare young women against sweet-talking suitors. How can we have girls who know what to do and are not too naive or innocent, I guess, in the wrong way, because if they're not educated and they're just sort of sheltered too much, right, then they'll be willing to fall for these lies. That was sort of the idea. Sometimes reader sympathies are moved against the girl who was seduced, so we are meant to feel sorry for her. Other times we're meant to feel disgusted by her, because that was the social morality at the time. So you're trying to make readers feel sorry for this girl but disgusted by what she's doing. But ultimately the message is to avoid being like her. And that is a book for silly girls, I put as the title here. But ultimately that's the message of seduction novels. They're trying in a way to titillate the reader and make the reader want to watch and pay attention and be interested, but also warn them at the same time. It's kind of, to me, like an episode of Law and Order SVU, right? Like they'll have in that show, people want to watch that show. I mean, people binge watch it, right? It'll be on USA Today for 8 hours during the day, and people will sit there and watch all of them because it's interesting. And yet each one of those episodes very much has kind of a message, either to not judge the rape victim or to try to avoid being like the victim, you know, stay away from guys who are going to put things in your drink or what have you. And this is basically the same message, that they want to have almost a soap opera quality to these books so that people will read them, and yet also be afraid of these situations. The importance of class. So social class plays a role in this book in several ways, and I just wanted to kind of explain what social class would have looked like at that time. I have a little picture here of the colonial American social hierarchy. We have gentry, and then gentry in different parts of the country. What that looked like in the South versus the North, for example, the middle class and different middle class groups, and then servants, and then slaves. But much of the book, it's really more British than it is American. So the gentry would be wealthy lords, dukes, and earls. They don't work. These are gentlemen. So they own tracts of land and they live off annuities, which are yearly payouts of interest from inheritances. So Mr. Temple, his father, is an earl. His family is part of the gentry. Lucy's family, Charlotte's mother, Lucy's family is not part of the gentry, and therefore the marriage would not have been a good match. And that is why his parents disown him, or his father disowns him. The other person who is gentry is in this story is Julia Franklin. So they talk about she has 700 a year. That means that she has an inheritance or there is land and she's living off the annuity, and that's quite a good amount of money. So she can make whatever match she wants, and she's interested in Montraville even though he is a little bit beneath her in station. So the middle classes, people who worked were kind of looked down upon, but there are some trades where they could have a little bit of social prestige. So the military, men, and we're going to talk about military more in a moment, but people in the military were still considered gentlemen. Wealthy merchants, they had the money, but not the station, right? So in some ways, they're in a weird position where they have money for things, but not the social status. A lot of times, these people would marry up, trying to marry the gentry to get that kind of wealth. Lawyers, doctors, tradesmen, sometimes, again, if they have a lot of money, and some higher level clergy. So this book really is meant for middle class readers, and it, for the most part, is about middle class people. Colonel Creighton is in the middle class. Mademoiselle LaRue and Mademoiselle DuPont as teachers would be middle class women. I have here, they worked as teachers or governesses. Wealthier middle class women managed the servants in the household. So when Mademoiselle LaRue marries Colonel Creighton, they have a little bit more money, and that's basically her station. So she's, and I think people are like, well, she just stayed at home, and as a lot of women did. Yes. But running the home really was like running a business. You had, scullery maids and cooks and ladies' maids and housekeepers and laundresses and all of these groundskeepers, gardeners, all of these people would be working at the house. Sometimes the house also was attached to a piece of land, and they might have tenant farmers on that land. So the woman of the house was really managing all of that. It's before automation. There's no washing machines, there's no ovens without fire, right? So many of those things took a lot of time, and that is basically her station at that point. So when Charlotte comes to her looking for help and looking for money, she's really doesn't want to lose her station or be found out that she was associating with this girl. The working classes are below this. These are people in shops, journeymen on ships, apprenticemen, craftsmen, sorry, I forgot the word, a blacksmith. So these are people who are working but don't really have much education, and they're not making quite as much money. So working women would do seamstress work or be in domestic service. And again, we don't see this quite as much in this book because most of the characters are in the middle class. But what happens to Charlotte is that after she becomes pregnant, she falls from the middle class down here to the non-working classes. So this is below the servant class, and we don't really see this as much in this hierarchy picture that I was able to find. But in Britain, certainly, these are paupers or vagrants who are having difficulty finding work. So there's workhouses that are built by churches to give them work. There's the poorhouse that they would go and live in. There were societies for poor unwed mothers, kind of like a shelter. But for her to fall really from a wealthy middle class position to a non-working class and to be penniless and homeless and not know where to go, you can see how tragic that really would be. And I feel like it's a little bit difficult. Single moms even now have a hard time. But for this person, there were not really any government supports. There were not any social supports. And she would have really been reviled for what she had done, for running off with this man, and then, the visibility of being pregnant. So it's quite important to understand her position here, and the fact that her father comes looking for her after she runs away is also astounding and shows his good moral character, because other people in the middle class, and other people in the gentry are refusing to help her. And lastly, 6, how to buy your way into the military. So there's a flashback scene to Charlotte's parents, Mr. Temple and Lucy Eldridge, falling in love. And I think it's confusing if you don't understand the history of what exactly is happening with Lucy's father. So the Eldridges, those are Charlotte's grandparents. They were forced to borrow money so that their son could have a commission in the military. The military, as I said, was one of the few middle-class positions where men were still really considered gentlemen. So they're almost in this weird position between being part of the gentry and being part of the middle class. Because certain, I don't know if I have this. No, I don't. So if you were the son of an earl or a duke, but you had possibly 4 or 5 other brothers, you're not going to inherit that much money as the youngest son, right? So what many younger sons of wealthy gentry would do would be to get a commission in the military. And similarly, sons of middle class men, where they didn't maybe have as much money to inherit, but they still wanted to keep a good social status and make money, they would also go into the military. So from 1683 to 1871, quite a long period of time, almost 200 years, men with money could purchase their ranks so that they were considered socially acceptable and they would not actually see battle, or they would at least be somewhat sheltered from it. I think, in the times of the Revolutionary War, almost everyone saw battle, but at other points when there was not as much fighting, they would be in higher ranking positions, kind of making decisions, as opposed to the more poor people who would be out on the field as foot soldiers. So it's really set up almost with a social strata within the military. You have men of a higher social class buying a rank to have that position. And then the less wealthy men, the poor, are as foot soldiers on the battlefield, actually seeing battle. So because they had to purchase their commission for their son, in part because of this, and then other details that I won't go into because I'd like you to read them, Charlotte's grandparents, the Eldridges, go into debt. And the father, Charlotte's grandfather, is thrown into debtor's prison. This was done through in the United States and in Britain for quite a long period of time. So if people owed a lot of money that they could not pay back, they would be imprisoned for a period of time. And I believe to as punishment, but also to work to pay off those debts. In 1834, that is when debt imprisonment was abolished. So up until that point, this still was happening in the colonies and then the early United States of America. So that is some history and background on the book Charlotte Temple. And join me next time to learn a little bit more about the book itself, and we will talk about some of the characters and themes. Thanks.